listening to The Good Fight, where campus meets Christ.
Hello, I'm Grace-Elleda Gonzalez.
And I'm Timothy Kinnaman.
And today on The Good Fight, we're going to be doing something new.
Something new.
And talking about democracy.
Just talking about it.
Just talking about it.
Like, for real this time. We always say that we're just talking about things, but this time we're literally just talking about it.
Yeah, we'd like for everyone to know we came into this 100% unprepared. Or at least I did.
I wouldn't say unprepared. Where unprepared was the preparation.
Pardon?
Since we're just talking about it.
Oh, yes.
You don't
right.
research
We don't
for
have
a conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
This is just talking.
We're coming in just to talk.
We're just recording ourselves having a conversation.
Yeah, we thought we'd do something new and fun and hopefully interesting and enjoyable.
And easier, to be honest, easier on our end because we're doing 3 episodes this weekend. Recording.
And out of order.
Yes. As you'll find out.
You will find out in a few weeks just how confused we are.
Yes.
But this is episode 9.
Episode 9, indeed. Yeah. And we're calling it to kind of steal from a far better writer than I probably will ever claim to be, Tocqueville. Democracy in America.
Yeah. Because
one of the things that I've always thought about recently, especially recently, I should say, is this idea that, this hefty book here, the Bible, was written in a time, in many times, but at no time was it written in a democratic culture.
Right.
Maybe, it's not like there were ancient Greeks sitting down writing the Bible. And so, especially considering moments in the New Testament where government is explicitly mentioned.
Right.
Thinking especially of Romans chapter 13 for me. And at that time, during the first century AD, Rome was not a democracy, at all.
By any means.
As I'm taking a class right now mostly on the first century BC, but it's a lot about kind of that transition from in the end of the first century BC, Rome transitioned really from a republic, very similar idea to what America is today, sort of different in many important regards, most notably.
But as similar as you're going to get from that.
Right. Yes.
Time period.
And it really gets taken over by an autocrat, the first emperor, Augustus. And Augustus is emperor for, I believe, the first half of Jesus' life.
Mm-hmm.
He dies in 14 BC, or 14 AD, my bad. And then it's his grandnephew or something, who he adopts as his son, Tiberius. Mm-hmm. Very complicated. And
interesting family tree.
Yes,
we love him.
Very interesting. And Tiberius continues what his predecessor has done. And pretty much by the time Tiberius is emperor, there is really no reason to call it a republic.
Right.
But it is, they pretend it's a republic because it keeps people happy, I guess. But so, given this history, and the fact that this is the case for all of New Testament authorship, my question then is, how should we consider how that influences what is written in the Bible when we interpret it in our modern day, since we live now in a more democratic government?
At least when I'm thinking about it, I read a book relatively recently. It's not really related to this at all, but it's called The Blue Parakeet by Scott McKnight. And basically one of the main premises of his, or actually the premise of his entire book, is that we should be reading scripture with tradition instead
mm-hmm.
of through tradition. And what he means by that is that when you're reading it, you're not reading it apart from context. And so
mm-hmm.
by seeing the Bible as one story, you are seeing how each of the puzzle pieces, well, that's my way of putting it, but each part is even more beautiful because of the context it's been put in, instead of only through the context, or not through the context, only through basically tradition. So a lot of what he's concerned with is kind of like is post-Bible, which basically is like, after early church, so like medieval onwards of tradition that has been created and instilled within the church. And he's trying to like kind of discuss and break apart kind of the differences between what should we be doing like with tradition, and what should we be doing, or what have we been doing through tradition that needs to change. And I think the reason why I bring this up in this context is I think that speaks to the issue of a difference in cultural context.
Right.
Where we have a government in the New Testament, and also, so in the very beginning of the Old Testament, we don't really have a government, not quite in a modern sense.
The judges.
We have the judges, and ultimately, I think we've discussed this before, but they asked, Israel was like, God, give us a king. Everyone else is a king. We want a king. And then from there onwards, you basically just have a sole authority, like a sole governmental authority, functionally, whose basically the entire like structure of government is based on that from then onwards. And so I'm like thinking about something like give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God or is God's. One of the things that strikes me in that is how there's a lack of control at the time, in the sense, as opposed to nowadays, in the sense that obviously modern times, if you don't pay your taxes, you still get in trouble. Like that premise, that's remained the same.
Yes.
But what's different is that at that time you couldn't control how much you were being taxed.
Yeah.
There's a lot of uncertainty in it. Nowadays, you can vote for different people who will raise or lower your taxes depending upon their policy. And so the question, at least for me, then becomes of what other responsibility do you have, or maybe responsibility is the wrong way of putting it, but like how does being a Christian impact the way that you are living as a citizen in a democracy?
Right. Taking
what we know, what we've learned from the Bible, like from the story of who Jesus is. I present that to you.
Right. I mean, I would frame that as a question of ownership, really, in the sense that in those autocratic systems, it was very much that the emperor, the monarch, is the owner of everything that the state is. So that included currency. Whereas today, we live in a system that views the people as sovereign. And so it isn't that the government figures own the state and its property and all of that, but it is that those are like possessions of the people that certain individuals are granted by consent, I guess, authority to manage and oversee those properties. So in looking at it that way, it doesn't really clarify any sort of answer that we can derive from it. But I think specifically looking at it from a Christian perspective, one thing that I've always considered very, very important is this idea that we've talked about, is love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
And that's very easy to consider how it plays out in a private aspect. Is, with, part of it is the Sermon on the Mount. And when someone asks you to go a mile, you go an extra mile. When someone asks for, what is it, like?
Take the shirt off your back.
The shirt off your back. Yeah, but I thought you gave them the shirt off your back. They ask for something else, and you give them that plus the shirt off your back.
They ask for a jacket off your back. I don't know I don't remember.
Yeah. Too bad. But yeah, that idea that, you're not only giving, but you're giving more. The golden rule. Treat others how you want to be treated. And that's very easy to see how it plays out in the private life.
Yeah.
Because it's just, you literally treat someone how you want to be treated. Where it gets iffy is in the public domain. Because now it's not so much that you're dealing with your own resources, right, but you're considering everyone else's resources as well. And so it doesn't really tell you, oh, we need to vote Democratic or we need to vote Republican, to put it in a very American context. But what it does tell you is what the ends that you justify the means should be. And the ends should be, how do we ensure that people are treated the best they can?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, again, that very basic premise doesn't tell you how you should act in a democracy.
Right. Yeah, there's clearly people on all sides and all
Mm-hmm.
opinions who are Christians who believe that what they're doing is like loving others.
Right.
And that's what makes it tricky, right?
It is, certainly, yes.
Yeah.
And I think the most difficult part is, especially in today's culture, is to just recognize, especially as Christians, to recognize that even if there's a Christian on the other aisle,
Mm-hmm.
So to speak, that at the end of the day, they're trying to achieve the same ends as you or me or whoever it is trying to achieve. They just have different means.
Yeah.
And I think once you recognize that fact, it makes it a lot easier to have an open and honest and respectable conversation, because you're no longer approaching it as such and such person wants to like harm people.
Right.
You're quite frankly, you're making the issue more complex than you want it to be, in saying that this person actually really wants to help people. They just have a different way of going about it.
I mean, that's definitely one of the biggest problems with character attacks in like politics, we'll say, is maybe specifically, or like the vilifying of those who disagree with you, is that you are assuming kind of intentions of another person, but negative intentions specifically, which inherently make it a lot harder to have a conversation with them.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, you could imagine, right? Like if you're going into a conversation and the other person's like, you are a terrible person, you hate everyone, you don't love people, like you just want your own gain, you're not going to want to have a conversation with that person, especially if you genuinely believe that what you're doing is, or like what you believe is loving to someone else. But if someone approaches you with a conversation of like, with mutual respect, saying, no, I think what you are, like, I think you're trying to love someone, I think, or everyone, I think you are like trying to do what is right, but I just like, I think that what you're doing it in a way that I don't think is actually the best.
Right.
And obviously that's still a hard conversation to have. Like, it doesn't make
Definitely,
the conversation,
yes.
like, the topic of how do you love people is inherently hard. Like, it is...
In the public realm. I think it's usually quite simple in the private realm.
I don't know. What do you mean by that?
I mean, I guess you give generously, in a manner that is actually beneficial.
See, I feel like that's the hard part. It's like, I think in the very nature, let's say you have someone who comes into your life somehow. I don't know, you meet them at church and they're really struggling in one way or another. I think the very act of deciding what the best way to help someone, even in that sphere, is an incredibly hard thing to do. Even if it's like with your own time or money, etc. Because I think there is a lot of wisdom and discernment in how do you help a specific individual. There's one person who, like, let's say they're struggling with like alcoholism, and your way of helping them might be very different versus someone who, even something like as simple as like an alcoholic versus like someone who's addicted to drugs. Like, you're going to approach them, obviously both of them are still addictions, but like you're going to approach them as different individuals because they are different individuals. Right. So I feel like there is like, I don't know, I feel like maybe in certain cases, like, let's say we're cooking dinner and let's say you're cooking outside and there's no light, right? As we used to do, or as you used to do a lot. I could recognize pretty easily that me walking, and I had a light inside. Let's say I like knew that I had a light. I could recognize pretty easily that the loving thing to do would be to like bring that light out to you, right? But I feel like that's an instance. Not all instances are as easy as that.
I see what you're saying. I think, though, it's still easier than the public domain,
Mhm,
mainly
okay.
because, the individual instance might be harder, but it's still a single individual, right? You just have to assess that individual,
Oh, yeah,
and
okay.
and
As opposed to whole
as opposed to like
unknown people.
what's the best for everyone?
Right.
Like, that's a much harder question.
Or even
I
saying
think.
like you're not just responsible for your own assets, you're responsible for someone else's, right?
Right.
Like when it comes to taxes, for example,
Mm-hmm.
it's like what you were like choices that you make in terms of electing people impacts not only what you have but what others have.
Because part of what makes it inherently difficult is recognizing that I think what you think is best for you might not be what is best for everyone.
Okay, originally when I walked into this conversation, I was thinking that having, let's say you have a monarch, having something like a monarch where you don't have it, you have very little personal control, requires a lot of trust. And I thought, that seems like it requires probably more trust in God than being a part of a democracy where you get to have an input. But just now, when you just said that, I would like to change that. I'd like to change my mind. And I don't know if I'd go so far as to say it requires more trust, but I think it definitely requires as much trust in God that whatever your vote is, or however you are interacting as a citizen, that what you're doing is like God will work for good. In the same, well, not exactly the same way, but in a similar way, if you have no control, trusting that God will provide despite, let's say you have, everyone's sinful, right? So like despite having a sinful ruler, as everyone is, so it's that God will provide and will do what is ultimately good. In the same way, now we have to trust. I don't like this, but we sorry. But now we also have to trust that God will be, like, whatever happens, God will be ultimately working for good.
Right. I think there's something to be said about having trust that God will control one person versus having trust that God will control, in America, 350 million people.
But like, it shouldn't matter, right?
It doesn't matter, but I mean,
it feels different.
Human minds like to think about magnitudes, and
it's like God's just as sovereign either way.
Right.
He's infinitely sovereign.
But even in the sense that having control over it too introduces another whole dimension where now you have to have trust that God is directing you, and I think that's one of the hardest things probably to have trust in.
Yeah, okay, that makes me think about King David, or even Solomon. Let's take Solomon, actually, because he was considered wise, right? So you have this man who's considered wise. He is in that position of individual power at a different scale than our individual power, but still individual power nonetheless. And you have his request to God, right? His request is that he has wisdom, and God's gives him wisdom. And yet, despite his wisdom, what we see, the pattern that we see, is that when Solomon is actively seeking after God, good things happen. That's a very poor way of phrasing it, but let's not necessarily prosperous things. I think there should be a distinction, but what happens is, okay, they're it's hard to make the distinction. What I'm trying to say is that maybe one way of putting it is when he's actively following God's will, non-sinful things happen. And when he's just reliant upon his own wisdom, it goes horribly astray, right? And we see that because he's sinful, because we all are sinful, there is this, maybe this is not reassuring, but there is this going astray. But also, it's only because of Solomon and his stupidity and sinfulness that we have the genealogy that gets to Jesus. So it's we can see, taking a step back, that even though in his quite expansive individual power, he was sinful. Just like David. David used his power to kill a man because he wanted to sleep with his wife. We can so clearly see that that's not right. But at the same time, it's through that, through that affair, that we have Jesus.
Romans 8:28.
So it's we can see from that instance that God is so clearly working in the lives of those who have infinite power. Or not infinite, sorry. Individual power.
Individual, yes. Or temporal governmental power.
It's hard, right? Because, like, I can say all that, but when it comes down to me voting, I'm still petrified.
Mm-hmm. And, I mean, the other dimension to this question that is very, I mean, it has been quite heated in the American context is to what degree, and especially today, I think, with the rise of secularism, is to what degree do you pursue your faith in government? Given that, you know, we have control over government, to what degree does that temporal power, to what degree does that need to what degree do we need to utilize that to aid the kingdom of God?
Oh, you mean here on earth?
Here on earth. And I mean, that is a deep, hard question that Christians have been struggling with a long time. Yeah, I mean, you have answers on both sides. I mean, you have someone like Augustine, who in City of God says pretty much, you know, we're pilgrims on earth, and temporal peace is good enough. That's all we need. And so as long as that institution exists for peace, that's all we needed to do. And then you have someone more like Aquinas, who then takes that and says, well, actually, the eternal power is greater than the temporal power, and therefore the eternal mission is more important than the temporal mission. And, you know, you have, I mean, even Protestants, you know, Augustine and Aquinas were both Catholics, but Protestants take different routes on the same question as well. You have someone like Luther, who writes that, more like Augustine, there should be a separation there. Or someone like Calvin, who literally goes and makes Geneva,
right,
which is just literally the Christian city. So I don't, you know, I'm not going to espouse that one side is correct here.
But it presents the tension.
Yes. And I think part of what causes that tension is the question we're dealing with. The fact that the Bible wasn't written in a time when Christians had any authority.
Right.
They were literally persecuted, yeah. Well,
may have been prosecuted.
Yeah, Paul was certainly prosecuted.
Full sticks into the law.
So,
i.e., thrown in prison.
Yes, persecuted, and so there was no capability to have any temporal power. You know, it was the boot on your neck, and that's why Romans 13 is specifically, you know, be subject.
I mean, that's why I think there is this weird tension in being a part of a democracy, because on the one hand, there are times where it does feel like there's a boot on your neck. But at other times, it's like, no, you have the responsibility of individual power. Mm-hmm. So the question then is, how do you balance, one, the responsibility, but two, I guess it's like trust on two different ends. It's trust that God is working through your decision, and trust that God is in control even when it doesn't go the way that, not just the way that you would have liked, but like in the way that you, I'm trying to think of a good way of putting it, but like way that you feel like a boot's on your neck. Mm-hmm. Because both of them are at odds. Not at odds, it's just like from a human perspective, they seem at odds. Mm-hmm. From a spiritual perspective, they both very much seem to be rooted in trust. Right.
I mean, one way to think about it is, well, since it's a democracy in some degree, that boot that you think is on your neck is like, part of it's your boot. It's like you're standing on your own neck. The difference being that you didn't necessarily ask for it to be that way. Trust.
That's hard.
It is.
It's really hard. I think that, yeah, I don't know. It feels like that's very much the root of, at least for me, this issue of there's a lack of knowledge, and a lack of knowledge breeds uncertainty.
A lack of foreknowledge.
Yes, right. A lack of foreknowledge, which breeds uncertainty. Actually, not even foreknowledge, right? It's like, I can speculate and logic, like, or reason my way to what I believe is logical and what I believe is most in accordance with what God desires.
Mm-hmm. Right, and God gives us that ability.
Right, he does. But ultimately, like, I am a fallen human being, and I can believe things are logical when in fact they're not.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so there is a certain extent to which I don't trust knowing that I'm a sinful person, knowing that I'm not perfect. There is a lack of trust and a lack of like knowledge or trust in my own knowledge, which breeds uncertainty.
But at the end of the day, you just have to have trust that even in your ignorance, even in our ignorance, because we're all fallen sinners, when we vote, when we participate in government, that God will use even our imperfection to bring about his desired will. I mean, you think of something as basic as the gospel, and that's literally what you see, is you have the greatest redemption in the history of the world
brought about by
the sin of man.
Right.
In the sense that, man thought he was conquering God by killing Jesus, but really it was God conquering death.
Yeah, I mean, you think about like Pontius Pilate, right? Pontius Pilate chose to condemn Jesus. I mean, give or take. He decided to go along with the wills of the people, and he decided this is a good way to end peace or create peace. And he didn't particularly care about this fellow named Jesus, right? So he chose to send him along his way to be crucified. And you think about that action I think about that action as something that I feel like emulates this too pretty well, of even if I'm doing something, and obviously that's not the desire, right? Like, even if I'm doing something that's wrong, I don't desire to be doing that which is sinful. Like, that's not, that obviously continue to pursue what you believe to be the truth. Mm-hmm. And
you don't just do willy-nilly.
Yeah, I mean, like,
God
yeah, I mean, Paul speaks directly to this. It's like, should I sin more knowing that I'm, like, there's grace? And Paul's like, excuse you.
Yeah.
You better not be doing that. And this is the same thing, where it's like, you're not, even though we know that there's grace, and even though we know that God will provide and is working through our sin and in our sin, doesn't mean that we want to keep on sinning.
Mm-hmm. In fact, quite the opposite. It means we want to sin less.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't know, maybe that is also a tension point. Knowing that you will sin, and yet wanting to sin less.
It's like the whole walk of the Christian life, right? This battle, it feels like a battle. It is a battle between sinning and not wanting to sin. It's like Paul who says, like, I do what I, or what is it? I do what I do not wish to do, but what I wish to do, I do not do. However it goes. Basically, long story short, in Romans, he's saying, I sin, and I don't want to sin, but I keep sinning anyway. Mm-hmm. And that is a core tension in the Christian walk, which is, we are sinful people. We will continue to sin, even when we're growing closer to God. And even when, like, he is working and transforming us. But at least in this temporal life, we'll never be sinless.
And to bring it all the way back to this question of democracy, I think it's the same kind of wanting it to be perfect and always striving to get it to perfection, but knowing in the meantime that until Jesus comes back, it
won't be.
It's not going to be perfect.
It's a yearning. We have a yearning for a reason.
Right. And that is also another difficult thing to live with.
Yeah.
Although I think there is a way to view it where you do have certainly hope. In the sense that...
I think you have to.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Certainly. Not only the hope in the redemption of everything in Christ's second coming, but also the upward trajectory towards that. Knowing that, I mean, there's some pretty horrible stuff in Revelation that I would never want to live through. But I think living through that would be amazing, because at the end of all that, what do you have? You have the greatest thing ever. You have Right. That the restoration of the relationship, the fulfillment of everything you've yearned for.
That's crazy. It's crazy cool. It's one opinion, but...
So, maybe one last thing to think about is the election that just took place.
Mm-hmm.
And applying what we've just kind of come up with to now.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know. Some pastors will only preach about what's currently going on. Some pastors never preach about what's going on. My favorite pastor is the one who mostly doesn't preach about what's going on until it's very important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is something that is very important. And so maybe the first application is, well, what we've been talking about this whole time is trust.
Yeah.
And as that manifests, there is
in what ways do you need to trust God right now?
Yeah. Many ways.
All the ways.
But thinking about trust not only as, this general concept of, we need to trust. I think there's actionable ways that it influences how you interact with people.
Mm-hmm.
So the first of which would be not having a spirit of fear, but of hope. And so, when you're talking about politics, there's two sides. One side wins, one side loses. If you're on the winning side, well, first of all, you don't gloat. Because it's not a victory. Not for you, at least. It's a victory. I mean, no matter what, it's a victory for God. But it's not like there's a sense of winning. Because at the end of the day, I think the democratic process, this is something that's pretty prevalent in constitutional interpretation, is the idea of the marketplace of ideas. And so that democratic process, not to sound too Hegelian, but it is one of the ways that we can pursue God's truth by collaborating and hearing two different sides of an issue, plus two plus sides. The entire idea of the philosophical dialogue.
Right.
The dialectic.
And shifting away from it being more of a battle as opposed to a...
collaboration.
Exactly.
It's a
conversation.
Like a group effort towards the top. And so, you might have won the election in that regard, but the process is the true winning process. So that's the first way. Winning, if you win, it's not a matter of victory to gloat over. And if you lose, likewise, it's not something to be afraid of, right? Because as we see with the death of Jesus, in the end, it's God's victory either way. And similarly, you can view it as the democratic process is the victorious process. And so, even if you lose in one regard, at the end of the day, it's the process that is really winning out.
This has been a really fun conversation. Almost, I think it may be my favorite so far. Am I allowed to say that?
I think.
I feel like
people are allowed to disagree. Okay, and then you can have a conversation with them and find out what's the truth.
Yeah, we can discuss it. And on that very note, if you would like to disagree with me or agree with me and would like to discuss, you can stay up to date with all of our content by following our social media accounts. We have exciting news, y'all. New ways to reach out to us, new ways to interact. We started up our own Instagram, so we are still part of Columbia Witness, have no fear, but we now have our own Instagram. It's called The Good Fight Pod, and that's our username for both Instagram and Facebook. Right,
because they're owned by the same company.
They are. Instagram is owned by Facebook,
in
case you didn't know. And you can also find us at Good Fight Pod on Twitter.
Yes. The difference being Twitter apparently did not allow us to get the THE at the beginning. So it's just Good Fight Pod, no the, unfortunately.
It's tragic. So, yes, at Good Fight Pod on Twitter. But have no fear if that's confusing. You can still find us at the same old email address we've had since the beginning,
yes,
which is witnessthegoodfight@gmail.com.
Yeah.
And we look forward to hopefully having some conversations with you. Feel free to send us any recommendations for conversations you'd like to hear about, more informal or more formal, whatever it may be. We'd love to talk with you.
And next week is a holiday.
Woohoo!
Next week is Thanksgiving Day. So I hope everyone will be enjoying a nice time with their family, maybe with friends, on your own, whatever you're doing. But if you're alone, especially, we will be releasing an episode next week. So I hope you have an opportunity to give that a listen. And I hope you're thankful for it, as we are. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on The Good Fight, where campus meets Christ.